it's crazy, but it's
You're watching Channel Z, the world's leading zombie apocalypse channel. Broadcasting live from Studio Z.
makes me act the way I do.
Great. And hello. Welcome to another episode, an exciting episode of the Dr. Zed Show on Channel Z for a discussion of evolutionary medicine in the apocalypse. As always, I am your host, Dr. Zed, aka Joe Alcock, MD, professor of emergency medicine at the University of New Mexico. Today we have a great topic. We're going to ask the question, what was up with Charles Darwin, with Chuck? Did he have long COVID or symptoms that were like it? He was clearly a very sick man, a history that not many people know about. But today we'll get into that. We'll talk about Darwin's illness. We'll talk about its overlap with long COVID and what might be up, what we can learn about both of those conditions. And yeah, it's going to be fun stuff. And I'm super happy to be joined. I'm not doing this by myself. We are going to be joined by my illustrious guest today. We have Dr. Erica O'Neill. You might know her. She's also on Channel Z as host of the Eat, Pray, Run show. And here she is. But she is well equipped to help us with this because she has a PhD in biology with an emphasis in history and philosophy of science. And she knows a lot about history of medicine and science. So we're gonna get into this, aren't we, Erica?
Awesome to be here. Thanks so much for inviting me, Dr. Zed.
Yeah.
Nice to be able to use my background in history in philosophy of science and medicine. I usually just talk about food and culture as the host of Eat, Pray, Run. But I also know a fair bit about how we used to conceive of human illness and disease and kind of how that's shifted over time.
Right. So listeners, you might not be aware that old Charles Darwin, there's a book that I've relied on. He's been heavily, his life has been heavily examined by biographers such as this one. This is Janet Brown, a book that I recommend. There it is. And she has a whole chapter on Darwin's illness. The chapter 7 is called Invalid, because it was a major focus of Darwin's life was that he was a sick guy. So Erica, what do you think was up with Chuck?
What wasn't up with Chuck? He had every gastrointestinal kind of issue that you could possibly have, and still kept kicking and researching for years. I'm going to pull up a quick chart here just so that we can kind of acclimate our readers to the host of symptoms that we're talking about today. Chronic fatigue, all the gastrointestinal problems that you could possibly have, nausea, vomiting, a swimming head, which is an interesting kind of way to describe something. I'm curious what
the dizziness or maybe a little bit of vertigo. You know, that's how a little lightheadedness. Sure.
Yeah. Rashes, eczema, just any sort of like autoimmune combined with gastrointestinal symptom that you can imagine. This poor guy had it.
Yeah. So skin stuff, gut stuff, and head stuff. That seemed like it. So yeah. So we have the illnesses and the symptoms. And what's there in table number 1?
So table number 1 off to the right there kind of breaks them down into organic and psychosomatic causes. And these are all historians of medicine and doctors who have kind of hypothesized throughout the years about what Darwin could have possibly been suffering from. And it's everything from his own self-described heart disease, you see at the very top there in his autobiographies, through lactose intolerance and a bunch of psychosomatic problems like this mind-body connection, which was really separated out, but which we're seeing really kind of overlap into something that's really diagnosable and has a huge impact.
It's interesting that the psychosomatic stuff, one of those references is 1918, right? About the birth of psychoanalysis. So yeah. So yeah, he was quite a sick person. Remarkably though, despite his illness, which confined him to bed for great periods of time, he was unable to walk. Apparently, he would retch and throw up after meals. People have commented though that he never got extremely skinny, so he was able to maintain an okay weight, and he lived up until at least his early 70s. So he had, a reasonable lifespan, and he also fathered 10 children. So yeah, 10 children. So the reason we talk about
anybody who's unfamiliar with Darwin, which probably like everyone has sort of a passing knowledge of him. The basis of what he's looking at is this sort of reproductive fitness. And if you look at how profoundly ill he was, the fact that he was able to pass his genes on to 10 children should not have aligned with the hypothesis that he was presenting in nature, where like really sick individuals don't have that reproductive fitness potential and they wouldn't be great mates and you'd kind of seek out someone else. But he seemed to also have the ability of, class and stature and money and all these sorts of trappings of Victorian society, which makes him a very eligible bachelor. And he was able to pass on his genes to 10 other kids, profoundly sick genes. But he
True.
broke the
So
mold.
10 children, of which 7 survived.
Yes.
Famously, he had a lifelong grief over losing his 5-year-old daughter, Anna. But 7 of his kids survived. And he did have, most of his kids actually didn't reproduce, but he did father grandchildren and has descendants to this day, of course. So yeah, there's that. So what do you think about his place of privilege and the fact that he was able to be sick all of his life and yet be so productive? He wrote On the Origin of Species. He explained a mechanism along with Wallace about how evolution could happen, which is natural selection.
So in this time frame, he would be described as a naturalist. So a naturalist is an early biologist, and it's kind of the people who had the privilege and the luxury to just be able to go out and sit in nature and kind of quantify and describe what's around them. And he did that wonderfully. They would go out, they would catch specimens. So they would go find all the butterflies or catalog all the finches that you could possibly find out in nature. And so that was what he was out there doing on the Beagle. And surprisingly, early on in his life, when he went on that months-long sea voyage, like he suffered dramatically from sickness, like seasickness. But aside from one instance of fever, he really didn't have any of these symptoms that impeded him. So he had just sort of the things that you would expect to suffer from when you're at sea for a really long time. And it was only when he returned that it really started to impact him in his work. He was still able to publish profoundly and impact an entire discipline. There's a bunch of correspondence with him and others at the time who were also these great naturalists who are coming from these positions of privilege that allow them to just sit there and think deeply about the natural world and their place in it.
Good question, Dave. He did have some palpitations and anxiety before he went off on the voyage. He wrote in his diary that he did not want to seek a doctor's opinion because he was afraid that they wouldn't let him go on the voyage. But he didn't have the profound weakness, exhaustion, fatigue, the retching that he had that really made him more of an invalid a little bit later in life. And some people have speculated that really he was aware that it was a big deal, right, to propose that humans were not an object of special creation by a divine being. That was going to ruffle some feathers, and so it took him a long time to write On the Origin of Species. And it's thought that distress and the fact that his wife Emma was a very religious woman, that may have contributed to his anxieties.
This is a wonderful question from David. I'm wondering if you can address it. If he had any sort of medical advice or interventions that he tried in terms of self-diagnosis or the medication of the time period.
Such a good question. Such a good question. So yes, the reason we're talking about this, and one reason why it can be the subject of biographers and huge tomes like this, is that he sought out all the advice he could get. He was a wealthy man. He went to all sorts of different specialists. He saw learned medical people of the era, and he also just absorbed any printed information he could get. So there was I'll see if I can find it. But I will mention this: all the medical cures failed to completely relieve his miseries. That was one quotation from this book. So he was unable to get relief despite really extensive self-diary. He was a scientist. He kept track of his symptoms. He discussed them in correspondence and in person with people. He sought out all kinds of medical cures. I can't find it right now, but there's a passage in the book that talks about him seeking out every possible thing in the post or in the literature, in the equivalent of journals at the time. He would have been absolutely all over Google if Google had existed back then. He was trying to find out what was wrong with him.
Lizzie Shoes' suggestion that he would be an awesome Reddit mod if he were still alive today.
Yeah, absolutely. You could just see how this would be translated into current times. And some of these things are universal, right? I see patients that have similar symptoms. I've suffered some of these things. We're all human. We have some issues that come up time and time again. I'm not, thankfully, nearly as sick as old Chuck, but I think we can relate to having some of these chronic symptoms.
Yeah, so I have a question for you, and it's why I'm wearing my trucker hat today. And I'd like to know what's with this long haul, if Darwin was a long hauler. So we pulled that from COVID long haul as kind
Yes.
of a
So
mention.
long COVID
Yeah, how
or
does it
long
relate?
hauler, those are both, cognates. They're similar ways of describing the same phenomenon, and it has a definition. So these are people, and now there's lots of them, who seem to have prolonged symptoms, long courses, longer than 4 weeks if you go by the CDC or the NIH definition. Symptoms of that we think are related to the infection itself. So what are those symptoms? Here they go. It affects every organ system that you can imagine, kind of like what was going on with Darwin, including the gut. You see the GI tract down there. But mostly for people with long COVID, that is this profound exhaustion, exercise intolerance, chest pains, shortness of breath, difficulty with blood pressure. We're seeing a lot of folks that have high blood pressure, dizziness, fainting. And other feature of this is that these symptoms are not improved with exercise. And so this is something that we've seen in other conditions, and in particular chronic fatigue syndrome, or its more modern proposed name, which is chronic myalgic encephalomyelitis, which is, I think, just another word for chronic fatigue. And interestingly, back in the 1800s, there was no chronic fatigue syndrome, but Darwin himself said he had something called nervous exhaustion. So he blamed his nervous system on his accursed stomach and said it was just nerves. So he was aware there was a brain-body connection, but this nervous exhaustion had quite a lot to do with his fatigue, and it has resonance in patients now with long COVID.
Do you know what nervous exhaustion would be called if he was a female instead of a male?
Ooh, this is good. This is good. He'd be called
Hypochondria.
He'd be called
What
hysterical.
males were called with that, but they didn't have the nervous uterus that would travel through their body, impacting everything around them. You got a guess yet? It's hysteria.
Yeah, there it is.
So he's a hypochondriac, but women were hysterical because they had a wandering womb, it was thought at one point in time in medical history, and that caused all sorts of flare-ups and pressed on their nerves in all sorts of ways that it would be expressed. So everything from gastrointestinal, that nervous exhaustion, all of these things were kind of enveloped in just the perils of being a woman.
A very gendered point of view and diagnosis, right?
Yes, medicine is very gendered.
Yeah.
It still is today in terms of like the care that you receive, and they can quantify those benefits.
Hysteria, from the Greek. So hysterectomy is a word for removing of the uterus.
For uterus.
So right. And hypochondriasis also comes from the Greek, hypo being below, and chondriasis being the ribs. So it came from the area underneath the ribs, which of course, if you push in that area, you're pushing right on your stomach. And so that would be, you can imagine that those Greek words would point to the area that Darwin most experienced, which was his gut.
Oh,
right?
What would have happened if Darwin were a woman at that point in time?
Well, I kind of wanted to
He
go
wouldn't
back
have been
to
traveling
that.
on the Beagle around the world, certainly not without a chaperone or anything of the sort. Even if he did have money, like the social prospects that he had for naturalism, if he had published under a male name, he probably could have gotten some traction. But it's not at all equivalent in terms of the ability to be seen and have your voice heard. It's very gendered. And if he had been a woman, he would have just probably been hysterical and confined to his bedchamber for a long period of time to get over the weakness that he had, because it's just touching on his nervous system, just a very frail disposition, can't be out in the world. Those sort of perspectives, super gendered.
Yeah. So we're so lucky to have your perspectives, not just because of your gender, but because of your expertise.
Yes.
And I want to encourage anybody listening or watching right now, smash that like button. Give us a like. It really helps us. It gets the word out so that we can help protect you and your family from the apocalypse of misinformation that's out there. Helps us fight off those zombie hordes. So please do that. That's a good reminder.
Also subscribe.
for all, and subscribe. Yeah, let's hit that subscribe button right now.
Never know what we're going to talk about next.
That's right. But to your point, and those are excellent points, apparently his symptoms really, he called it the demon of dyspepsia, which again is just another word for the gut. And according to Janet Brown, the biographer, these maladies were typical of the Victorian era. So there were lots of people, including some of his scientific compatriots, that had some similar symptoms. But yes, the fact that he was a wealthy man permitted him to pretty much able to publish, be productive. He had a wife and servants who looked after him. His kids were all enlisted in taking care of him. I agree with you. I don't think that could have happened if he was a woman, or it would have been way, way more difficult then. And maybe
I love Emily's comment here that it would have been a hobby, or perhaps he would have assisted his husband, who is the actual naturalist, and done a lot of the work behind the scenes, but gotten zero credit. It's also something that's very common in the history of science between male and female sort of wife and husband teams. And it's something that historians of science are still trying to pick apart and decipher today.
Yeah, there's no question that Darwin's wife, Emma Wedgwood, was integral to his success. And a question or a comment there from Diana Fleischman. He got more of his genes in the next generation than other people who have had 10 kids since. Oh, that's true. That's a great point. So Emma Wedgwood, who he married, was his first cousin. So he was more closely related to his partner with whom he had kids than, say, a random person, which means that because his wife also shared some of his genes, more of his genes got into his kids. That's a great point. Interesting. And speaking of that, we worry about inbreeding and all that. Not so much of an issue, I think, with first cousin mixing, although that's not really the topic of this conversation, although it's a good one. Thank you so much for that, Diana. There's a question about whether the disorder was heritable. And Darwin's one of his kids, Horace, had a nervous stomach and had some very, very similar symptoms. And when he went to get married, his bride's father forbade the marriage because of his fragile constitution. And Darwin had to say, look, he's going to be all right. And it turned out he did. He did have kids with, he got married, had children, etc. Good stuff. But speaking of heritable, some people proposed that it was lactose intolerance, that cream was the issue.
I just read that. What do you think of that?
Gene responsible for that. I'm going to say, look, for those listening, don't get any of your medical advice from a podcast or from YouTube or streaming video.
Yes, we're just giving you information. Don't take this as medical advice.
This is information and
contact a doctor who can look it over.
So we'll get into what I thought was wrong, what he might have had. I don't think it was lactose intolerance, but maybe. What do you think?
The mystery heightens.
Yeah.
I am curious about what you think Darwin had.
So if you lack the gene for lactase, then when you consume dairy products as an adult, your gut can't absorb those sugars. So that means they're available for digestion by microbes that cause flatulence, GI symptoms, retching, and diarrhea.
Okay. A lot of those line up. So why do you think it's not lactose intolerance?
Well, listen, I think we had that long list of possibilities. I just think it meets up with a lot of things. I don't know about the retching part of it. Because a lot of it was throwing up. I don't know how much of I think it was mostly lower GI and diarrhea, sure. But there's really a lot of talking about retching and without actually bringing anything up. I don't think the lactose intolerance explains that.
Interesting. So what would, if he came in with this sort of retching that happens over and over again into your ER, what would be one of the first things that you would kind of point to as being a possibility for his issues?
And there's Jason. Adults shouldn't be consuming much dairy anyway. No other animals, but humans do. And we do have this genetic imprint of lactase persistence, at least in some populations. It is more frequent in those populations that have a history of dairying. And you can imagine if you have this source of protein and calories in the form of milk, that could have a profound impact on one's fitness. And it's possible that when that genetic variant evolved, that it gave its bearers a benefit. But of course, it still is the minority of people that are able to consume large quantities of milk as an adult. And it's very likely that Darwin was lactose intolerant to some degree. Ooh, there's a, so let's for a second though, some people thought it's also a tropical disease. It could be Chagas.
Okay.
All
Yes,
right.
I've heard that before. So what's
Yeah.
Chagas disease?
So Chagas disease, it's a chronic infection by it's a Trypanosoma cruzi is the causative organism, and the vector is a kissing bug. And you can get this in South America. It's big, right? So you're sleeping under a thatched hut in South America. This big bug alights on your skin, sticks its proboscis through your skin, releases saliva that causes your blood to flow, and also releases this little trypanosome that invades your body and can cause a lifelong infection. So some people have said that, well, maybe he had Chagas disease. And this is an idea that actually dates back to the 50s and 60s of the last century.
Yeah.
Janet Brown
Really
doesn't think that he had that.
Okay.
She argues that it's unlikely that he had a latent tropical disease such as Chagas. Chagas is one that does last for decades. Most other things like helminths, those are self-limited and they go away, usually unless you're reinfected after some period of time.
Well, it's terrifying, that picture of the bug. I don't want Chagas disease. I don't want a proboscis to be injecting me with anything, and I don't want this sort of years-long malady to be bug-related. Are there any other hypotheses that you have that kind of go beyond that tropical disease?
Well, let's talk a little bit about drugs. Well, let's get into that. So,
all right.
Yeah.
Let's shift gears.
Let's talk about drugs. In my great state of New Mexico, we've legalized recreational marijuana. As of April 1st, you can go and buy it. And many of my countrymen and my fellow state residents went out and partook on April 1st and this last weekend to the tune of many, many millions of dollars. Having said that, there's lots more recreational use of cannabis. There's lots of higher degrees of THC, the active ingredient that people seek out in cannabis. And with both of those things, in chronic use, it can cause a vomiting syndrome. It causes retching and vomiting, and it's called cannabinoid hyperemesis. One clue to this is that patients that suffer this problem, they get some relief if they take a hot shower. And so this is a case report of a guy who took a 4-hour-long shower, used up all the hot water in his household, irritated his housemates, and only after that did he go to the ER to seek care. Because while he was under the hot water, his symptoms were relieved. So this water therapy worked for him. So this has two things that are in common with what old Charles Darwin had. One, this retching and this cyclical vomiting phenomenon that we see with cannabinoid hyperemesis. And Darwin famously got a water cure. He sought out hydrotherapy.
Yes, the Malvern treatment.
The Malvern treatment.
To that. We've got a quote here.
There we go. Let's bring it up. Malvern for hydropathic treatment. So he'd be under the care of doctors. They would give him showers. They would do massages. They would exercise him. And so cannabis users, some also get relief from this water therapy. Good point. So,
all right. So can you
was Darwin a pothead?
Why?
No.
Yes. Why does the water treatment work? And was Darwin a pothead? I think he was into snuff more than pot at the
he was
time.
Addicted, according to Janet Brown, addicted to nicotine in the form of snuff.
Yes.
I looked.
Victorian snuff boxes, I'm sure, very delicate.
I looked to see whether he might have partook in the green weed, and I couldn't find any evidence of that. So he wasn't a stoner. He didn't have COVID. He had something else. But who knows? But this gets back to this parasite idea, because Ed Hagen has proposed that there's a reason why humans evolved to use substances like nicotine and like cannabis in particular. So Ed Hagen, evolutionary psychologist, he's a great scientist. He's done really interesting work. He thinks that cannabis and nicotine can be self-medication, and in particular in populations where there's lots of helminths, lots of worms.
That's fascinating.
Yeah.
So there is precedent for this in the Congo and other areas too, where that's more prevalent, correct?
That's right. So if you go to a place where there's lots of worms, and one example of this is the Alcock, who are a group who inhabit the Congo Basin. They have a high degree of helminth or intestinal worm infections. And what he showed was that it tend to be lower status males that tend to smoke more. And these were the groups that were actually at the highest risk for getting infected. But once people smoked cannabis in that example, there was an inverse relationship between the amount of worms they had and how much THC they had in their bloodstream. So these are neuroactive chemicals. And the idea is that they actually paralyze the little worm. So the worm can't move with tons of THC, tons of nicotine. Nicotine's also a neurotransmitter. And the little paralyzed worm then gets shed and gets, pooped out. So he also showed that once people were treated with drug antihelminths, think about ivermectin, folks, different conversation. Anyway, it's used for worms. After being treated with these worm drugs, people that were frequent smokers were less likely to get reinfected with worms.
That's fascinating. That's really interesting that they have a lot of empirical evidence for that too, because it's something that's probably been passed down just through generations because it works. And you kind of just have that being adopted at a local scale. And then he kind of sees this and goes to get data to support that.
Okay. Yeah. Good stuff. It's hard to know, but if you hypothesize that self-medication using these neuroactive chemicals is a thing, at least the patterns in some of these traditional communities matches that. The worms are stoned. Yeah. And, we can find evidence of self-medication, not necessarily with nicotine, because I think nicotine's it's a New World plant, pretty sure. At any rate,
Dave's got a great question for you here.
Spot cure COVID. I'm not really going to go there. Yeah. No, I would not recommend it. But maybe. I'm tongue in cheek, guys. Tongue in cheek. But at any rate, some people say this sort of hypothesizing is silly or dangerous. It's adaptive storytelling. But Darwin really did a lot of this sort of thing. He thought about what could be reasons for things, including medical. He can be thought of as one of the progenitors of what is now evolutionary medicine. And as long as you subject these hypotheses to strict hypothesis testing, then we can find out whether there's some validity to this. And the great thing is, without having an evolutionary point of view, you wouldn't even think to ask the question of why it is that we see patterns of substance use in certain populations. So that might be why these things have evolved.
That's
Maybe.
Fascinating. Thanks for bringing it back around to evolution, Dr. Zed.
Absolutely. Let's get back to another comment here from Diana Fleischman. I know people who got exotic diseases in their 20s doing anthro or public health work who later suffered unusual cancers or autoimmune diseases, and that's always been my hunch, re Darwin. So again, is the idea that they picked up some sort of parasite? I think that it's worth thinking about that. And bringing it back to the long COVID idea, we're kind of joking around about Darwin and COVID, but it is a fact that exposure to a parasite or a life-threatening virus, or sometimes a bacterium, things like Helicobacter pylori that causes ulcers in the gut that maybe Darwin had, that these things can cause, even after the acute infection, they can cause prolonged disease. This is something that really, really happens. And so this post-infectious exposure is built in to, of course, the diagnosis of long COVID, right? It has an infection as part of it. These are symptoms that are the post-infectious sequelae, or after effects, aftershocks of getting sick. And so why does the immune system behave in this way? I think from one perspective, it makes perfect sense, right? That once your immune system has said, oh my gosh, this is a life-threatening virus, and it had to really ramp up all sorts of both innate immune defenses like interferon, antibody-dependent defenses for longer-term defense, that after that experience, if this is your rheostat in terms of how your immune system responds to things, that after that experience, it's going to be pushed over to one direction or the other. In this case, it might be on a hair trigger to respond to infectious threats. It might overreact. It might cause some of these symptoms. And a lot of what we're seeing might be thought of as being the behavioral immune system, activation of the innate immune system that can play into so many of these kinds of things. If you think about vomiting, right? If you vomit something that makes you sick, like a bacterium, that you can think of that as being a host defense. So we're, in Darwin's case, maybe much of what we were seeing was an activation of part of his immune system that was plugged into his gut, plugged into his brain, maybe certainly related to his infectious history. And then ever since then, historians, philosophers, physicians have speculated about what was wrong with him.
Yeah, he may very well have been a long hauler, just of a different sort.
That's right. Wow. Last question from Athena. Thank you for joining us, Athena. So my best guess about what Darwin had, I think he had some sort of, I would probably diagnose him with something like cyclic vomiting. I wouldn't say that it was because of cannabinoid exposure, but he had, in my mind, something like cyclic vomiting syndrome. And I would probably refer him on to a gastroenterologist, would give him the usual things, and probably like then, where Darwin complained that none of his medical cures helped him, and even the Malvern water cure doctor said that he seemed crushed by agony and he was never wholly well. A lot of these folks never get relief from the things that we can offer them. So one hope is that with the increasing attention to long COVID, that we will get closer to helping some of these folks that have long-lasting, prolonged, disabling symptoms.
Well, thanks for teasing some of that apart. We have a new diagnosis to add to that list that we showed at the very beginning, so that's exciting. And I appreciate you bringing it around to evolution and including me in a little bit of history of science.
Well, thank you so much. It's fantastic having you on. And I tell you what, I think we are at time. So that wraps up another episode of the Dr. Zed Show. Thank you so much for joining us for this truly apocalyptic discussion. Thanks so much for those great questions that came up. Thank you to my guest, Dr. Erica O'Neill. And I should tell you, tune in again to this channel next week for our next show, Should We Tear Down Capitalism, with Dave Lundberg-Kenrick, Zilikazi Kone, and Liz Grumbach. And again, hit that subscribe button, like us, and we will see you next time.
It's crazy, but it seems so logical. I can't deny that there is something supernatural with you. Makes me act the way I do.